Hey everyone, it is great to see you all again. I'm sure we've all heard that if you want to be a professional photographer, you have to use manual mode. Well, in today's video, I'm going to explain to you why that is just not true and a couple of ways you can use the other modes on your camera to get better results than using manual mode. I hope you all enjoy.
My name is Jalen Oban. I'm a landscape photographer and educator based in the Pacific Northwest. I create weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you with me on location to give you a behind-the-scenes look at what I do. If you enjoy the content, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribe.
Now, before we get too far, let's talk about the mode dial and a couple of modes you're able to choose from. First, of course, we all know that the A stands for automatic, and this is telling your camera that you don't care what the settings are and you just want to go out and shoot. This can work, but your camera's never going to know what kind of photographic situation you're in. It may struggle to obtain focus throughout your entire landscape scene or bump down your shutter speed too slow for your fast-moving subject. On the other end of the spectrum, we have manual mode. This allows you, the photographer, to have complete control over all three key exposure settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You can manually set these parameters based on your creative vision or what suits your scene that you're in. Manual mode works great in situations where lighting conditions stay the same or you have ample time to mess with your settings, such as studio or landscape photography. Using manual mode for astrophotography is also very, very helpful. You can also use manual mode as a learning tool to figure out how each exposure setting influences your final image. However, there are many situations where using manual mode can actually hurt you despite what the pros say. Adjusting all the settings manually can be very slow, especially in dynamic situations where the lighting is rapidly changing. There's also more room for mistake, especially when you're just starting out, such as overexposure or underexposure. Take this scene, for example, where I was using my telephoto lens to capture small bits of light that would shine on the walls around the waterfall. Because the light was changing so rapidly through the trees, using manual mode may have caused me to miss the shot by having to mess with my settings. This is where the other modes come in. These modes allow you, the photographer, to adjust certain settings while your camera does the rest of the work. These modes are called Aperture Priority, usually represented by an A or AV, and Shutter Priority, usually represented by an S or TV. You can think of these settings and what they do by how they're named. Aperture Priority tells your camera that that is the most important setting for your certain scenario, meaning that you want to take care of it. This allows your camera to adjust the shutter speed to get the exposure right. You, along with Aperture, are responsible for setting the ISO, although you can set this to automatic if the scene calls for it. If you're confused on what ISO is or how to use it, check out last week's video where I take an in-depth look at what this is and then also bust the ISO myth that we've all heard of. I'll have that linked above if you're interested. After you set the aperture and ISO, the camera then decides how fast or slow your shutter speed is to achieve 0 on the light meter, also known as middle gray or correct exposure. Aperture priority is perfect for genres that depth of field is the most important thing, whether you want a blurry background or everything in focus, and shutter speed doesn't matter. Genres like fashion, street, or portrait photography are great examples. These are genres that shallow depth of field is the most important thing, while shutter speed doesn't really matter. Take this scene, for example. As you can see, I can set the aperture to f1.4 and the ISO to 100 or auto, and the camera is then choosing the shutter speed, making sure it's keeping the exposure meter at 0 the whole time. The nice thing about this is that it will keep the exposure at 0 no matter how the light changes. I can also change the lighting myself to have a more desirable shutter speed if needed. But what if you're shooting sports or wildlife where the most important thing in your scene is the shutter speed? This is where shutter priority comes in. Whether you want to freeze the action or intentionally add blur, using shutter priority or TV for time value allows you, the photographer, to set the appropriate ISO and shutter speed for a given scene. You can also set the ISO to auto like before, so your camera not only controls the aperture, but the ISO as well. This really allows you to control what you want sharp or blurred in your scene, so you don't have to fuss with the settings when a bird is whizzing through your scene. Just like before, the camera will automatically set the aperture to make sure that the exposure meter is staying at 0. As you can see, no matter how fast I move the shutter speed, the camera is able to keep up and adjust my ISO and aperture. One thing to keep an eye out for is when you're adjusting your shutter speed and shutter priority, for example. If you see a blinking light on the back of your LCD screen, this may mean that you've reached a limit and your camera can no longer adjust to correct exposure. This might be because you can't open your aperture enough and may need to adjust your ISO if you didn't set it to auto. Now, if you notice that sometimes your images come back too dark or too light, remember that your camera is trying to expose for middle gray, usually doing a great job, but sometimes it can miss the mark. This is where you can use the exposure compensation dial to fix your camera's mistake. In semi-manual modes, moving the dial or setting to the left will make your scene darker and brighter to the right. This is telling your camera to adjust the setting that it is controlling. If you want a brighter image while using aperture priority, move the exposure compensation to the right. This will tell your camera to slow down the shutter speed to allow more light to hit the sensor, brightening your scene. Now, if you want a darker scene when using shutter priority, adjust the dial to the left. This will tell your camera to close down the aperture or use a higher f-stop number to darken down your image. You can also customize the placement of this dial so you know where it is depending on what mode you're using. Make sure you know what dial you have this set to depending on what mode you're in. It may also be a completely different independent dial like on my Sony a7R II. You're also able to set a limit to the settings in each mode. Say in shutter priority you don't want the camera to go above f16, or in aperture priority a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second is just too slow. You can set these parameters for your camera so you know how to set your shot. But what if you find yourself in a situation where shutter speed and aperture are both super important? This is where manual mode and using auto ISO can come in very handy. Using manual mode and setting your ISO to auto will allow you to choose how fast the shutter speed is and how deep or shallow your depth of field is while your camera adjusts the ISO to get correct exposure. This is great for wildlife photography where a fast shutter speed and shallow depth of field can be desired. Don't forget that you can also set an ISO limit for your camera so you don't worry about too much noise. But I hope you all learned something from this week's video. If you didn't already know, I started a Discord server for the entire community to come together, share photos, and give feedback. And then at the end of every month, I'll be selecting one of your photos to feature in the Discord as a monthly contest winner. Other than that, if you could subscribe to my weekly newsletter for weekly updates, and then for vlog, blog, and other video updates, if you could like and follow my Facebook page. Other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.